just so you don't miss important details, I would definitely say that that's true. Okay, let's do 20. There we go. If I can get it on there. So number 20. Let's go through each one.
Okay.
How about A? The total number of students with 4 siblings is expected to be equal at the 2 schools. Is that true?
No.
That's correct. In other words, in their sample size, it was equal, but there's more students at Lincoln than, or excuse me, there's more students at Washington than there are at Lincoln. So you would actually expect Washington to have more students that had 4 siblings. So cross that one out. Look at B. Total number of students with 4 siblings is expected to be 30 more than Washington. Well,
No.
that's going to require, let's see, yeah, no immediately because it should be less, right?
Right.
Which means we don't have to spend the time doing the math. Now, C looks like it's a distinct possibility, but before we do the math, let's look at D. Maybe we could rule out D, and if we can rule out D, we won't have to do the math. Can we rule out D?
Yeah.
We do not have to do the math. C is the answer. And just to let you know, I'll show you what the math would have been. There's 300 out of, at Lincoln, 2,400. So that's 1/8 have 4 siblings. At Washington, it's 300 out of 3,300. So that would have been 1/11. So at Washington, you should have 110 students, multiplying that by 11. And at Lincoln, you should have 80 students. So yes, Washington should have approximately 30 more. But that was a lot of math to do. And this is a great question to show you that you don't always have to do the math. If you can eliminate 3 of the answers, you've got the answer.
Yeah. Okay.
All right, 21. All right. First of all, we're in the hard section. So we expect this problem to be on.
Okay.
One of the ways you can make hard problems easy is when you see a few variables in the question, like X and Y, and you see those same variables in the answers, all 4 of them, then that means I can make up an X and a Y. And usually I can use my intuition to figure out the answer, and then all I do is figure out which of the four answers equals my answer. So let's play with that. Give me an X.
Okay. 2.
Always underline key parts of the question.
100.
In other words, 2 doesn't work. It's got to be a number greater than 100.
200.
Okay. So we're going to say X equals 200. The goal is for the estimate to be within 10 hours of the time it will actually take to complete the project. So we want this estimate to be within plus or minus 10, right? So somewhere between that. You with me so far? Now we're down to this part. Okay. If the manager meets the goal and it takes Y hours to complete the project, which of the following inequalities represents the relationship between the estimated time and the actual completion time? Y equals the actual completion time. So let's have a look at A. We have let 200 equal X. So if I do the arithmetic, it's 200 plus Y. We got to make up a Y. Give me a Y.
Okay. Like 150?
Yeah, just for the sake of argument, let's keep it within plus or minus 10 hours because they want the estimate to be within 10 hours of the actual. So Y has to be between 190 and 210.
Like 195?
All right, I would choose 190 just because it's a rounder number. I got to do some math here. I want the math to be easy.
Okay.
Is A correct? Is 200 plus 190 less than 10?
No.
So that's definitely not correct. Is 190 greater than 200 plus 10?
No.
Okay, that's not correct. Is 190 less than 200 minus 10?
No.
Actually, it is. And I'm sorry to confuse you. This did say greater than 100, and that means less than, so it's not less than or equal. Had you chosen 195, you would not have been correct. So you're right. That one is not correct. Let's look at D. Is minus 10 less than 190 minus 200? And is that less than 10?
Yeah.
No, actually it's not. It's minus. Oh, yes it is. It is as long as we use greater than or equal. And we can use greater than or equal because it says within 10 hours. Within 10 hours means 190 is okay. That satisfies the requirements. So yes, that is going to be correct, and it would not have mattered what number you picked. Notice you picked 190, but if you'd have picked 195, that's still correct. In other words, D is correct no matter what number you pick between 190 and 210.
Okay.
C, which looked like it was correct, would not have been correct had you picked 195. 195 would not have been less than 200 minus 10. So sometimes when you make up numbers, you are going to find two answers that actually work. And so you kind of have to give it a little more thought. Okay? But in terms of doing a very difficult problem like this, make up numbers. I didn't have to pick 200, 190, or 210. I could have picked x equal 150, and then y would have been somewhere between 140 to 160.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And then I could have picked any numbers I wanted, worked it out, and figured out that G is the only one that works. So when you're picking numbers, there's no real restraints. The only restraints on picking the numbers is pick numbers that make the math easy to do.
Right.
Now, this one is a little bit trickier because of the difference between greater than or greater than and equal. But the only one that says greater than is X. And the other one says within 10 hours. That actually means plus greater than or equal, or less than or equal, rather.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Let's go on. I got that same problem. No, actually, it ended up perfect. 22. Hold on a second. Hold on a second. This problem above it, I don't recognize. It's part of the problem. So, yeah, let me do a screenshot of that instead. In other words, problem 22 refers to problem to this equation
Right.
here. Now, whenever you see a problem like this and you see a really complicated equation that you've never seen before, know that you don't need to know any of that. Doesn't matter. They could have given you pi r squared. Okay, in other words, you don't need to know what r is. That's unimportant. At least, maybe. We'll see when we get to the questions. But in general, they're just giving you a complicated function. Okay. So which of the following expresses the square of the distance? And that is the distance. R is the distance from the radio, so you do have to know that. In terms of the intensity of the radio signal and the power of the signal. So what they're really saying is manipulate that equation and solve it for r squared.
Oh, okay.
That's all they're saying. In other words, notice all of your answers are r squared equals something. Well, that means all you need to know is algebra. Do the algebra on that, step by step. What's the first step? Starting with that, what's the next line you're going to do in order to solve for r squared?
The next line would be... How do you start a...
First rules of solving equations. Get rid of your denominators. How do I get rid of this denominator?
Multiply by the reciprocal?
No, you multiply by the denominator. In other words, here's what I'm going to do. Let me draw it on the larger equation. I am going to multiply the right side by 4 pi r squared. That is multiplying the right side by the entire denominator. And the only reason I can do that is because I can multiply the left side also by that exact thing. And now that has to cancel because that's why I multiplied it. So now I get this. 4 pi r squared times I equals p. Okay? You with me?
Mm-hmm.
Now how do I solve that for r squared?
Divide by p.
You divide by everything that's not r squared. I got to divide by the 4 pi, which is a multiplier, and I got to divide by the I, which is also a multiplier. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to draw it this way, just so there's no confusion. I'm going to divide the entire left side by 4 pi I. Notice that will leave r squared. Well, now I got to divide the entire right side by that same thing. And now that cancels with that cancels with that, and I'm left with r squared equals p times 4 pi over I.
Okay.
Now, let me point out this problem, if you learn how to do any problem, make sure it's this. This is just algebra. It's all it is. It's hard algebra because the variable you're solving for starts out in the denominator. So you got to get it to the numerator first. And then you got to get rid of everything else that's around it. That's the secret of solving equations. It doesn't
Okay.
matter how complicated they are. Whatever you're solving for, get it into the numerator and then get rid of everything else, and you should be left with something on the left side and none of that variable on the right. In other words, if I came up with r squared equals r times I, I'm not solving for r. There's still an r over there. So I got to come up with r squared on the left, totally by itself, and no r's on the right. All right, let's look at 23 because it also applies to that equation. Little trickier, as you would expect. You would expect the second question on a problem like this to be harder than the first.
Okay.
But not that harder. In other words, we just solved for r, right?
Mm-hmm.
So r squared equals p over 4 pi L, or 4 pi I, which means r equals the square root of all that. Now, they say the intensity is 16 times for one observer than the other. So, let's say observer A, his distance, is 16 times that intensity, as opposed to observer B, whose distance is just p over 4 pi I. In other words, the intensity is 6 times greater. That makes this distance smaller by what factor?
Just by 4.
Well, look at your answers.
By 1/4.
Uh-huh. And what you're really doing is the p, the 4 pi, and the I aren't changing. The only thing that's changing is the distance from this guy is the square root of 1/16. Well, that is 1/4. So that's the fraction of the distance from observer A to observer B.
Okay.
And like I said, that was definitely a harder question than the first one. This one is really algebra. If you do not know how to do this one, you want to review this. If you want to review any part for this test before you take it, make sure your algebra is spot on, because it's
Okay.
only a test of algebra. Nope, not yet. Can't get it. Oh, just one step at a time. How weird. All right. Do you know how to complete the square?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good, because that's what this is. It's a
Okay.
complete the square problem. But before you even attempt to complete the square, we got to know what the general formula for the circle is. What is it? For a circle, that's the easiest one. The ellipse is harder, the hyperbola is a lot harder, and the parabola is harder. But the circle is a piece of cake. What is it? X what?
X squared.
X minus h, where h is the x coordinate of the center of the
Oh,
circle.
okay.
Plus what? Y minus k. Where
I haven't used this in a.
well, I know. Unfortunately, they are going to ask you about it.
Okay.
You'll be lucky if you only get an equation of a circle. I've also seen questions about equations for ellipses. So circles and ellipses are worth learning. You're going to see one on there. And if you know this, these are not hard, especially if you know how to complete the square. But you have to complete the square, because notice what we're looking at over here is not in this format. So we got to put it in that format. Okay, and the way I do it is I gather my x terms, leave room to complete the square. I gather my y terms, leave room to complete the square, and I got my number. Now, the secret to completing the square is do not change the equation from row to row. Is that the same as that?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. I haven't done anything but rearrange stuff. Okay. Now, if I can complete the square inside both sets of parentheses, I will basically have it look like that. That's what I'm looking for. So, what do I need to do to complete the square on the left in the x's?
You need to get it so that like you can
There's a technique. You got to memorize the technique. You take half of the coefficient of the x term and you square
and
it.
then square. Okay, yeah.
Okay, so half of 4 is 2. 2 squared is 4. It is always added. Now, I just added 4 to the left side. I got to add 4 to the right side to balance things out. Now, do the same thing on y. What do I have to add inside?
+1.
Okay, did that on the left side. I got to add +1 to the right side. Now, because I've completed the square, I can write that in this kind of language. how would it be? What is that going to be equal to? X what squared?
X plus 2 or x minus 2 squared?
Or X plus 2.
Okay.
In other words, whatever the sign of that middle term is, that's going to be the sign on that term right there.
Oh.
Okay, how about the y? How can I represent that as what?
Y minus 1.
Yeah, it's whatever you got when you took half of that coefficient. In the first case, I got 2. In the second case, I got minus 1 or 1. But either way, you use the sign of the middle term. Now on the right side, what do I have?
4.
Okay. Now, if you remember your general equation, then you know everything about this circle. You know its center is at where? Remember, H is the x-coordinate of the center, K is the y-coordinate of the center.
Okay.
What's K? What's K?
K is -1.
Nope, nope, nope. The standard format is negative. It's x minus h and y minus k. So what is k?
+1.
And what is h?
4. +4.
That's the radius squared. H is the x-coordinate.
Oh, 2.
It's -2. In other words, it's always the opposite of that sign right there.
Okay.
The h-coordinate was -2. The y-coordinate was +1.
Okay.
Okay, so I know where that circle is. It's at -2, +1. That's its center. Now, the number on the right side is the radius squared. What's the radius of this circle?
4.
That's
no.
radius squared.
Yes.
What's the
60?
radius? 4 is the radius squared. R squared equals 4. What's R equal?
4.
R squared equals 4. The question says, what is the radius of the circle? The question doesn't say, what's the radius squared of the circle?
Okay. 2.
Okay. So you can see that, wow, there were a lot of things to know on this. And all you had to do was make one mistake and you're not getting it right. But if you know this general formula and you know how to complete the square, that's the only way to solve this problem. You don't have to know how to graph it. Didn't really need to know that. I didn't, in this problem, I really didn't need to know where the center of the circle was. The only reason I was asking was to make sure you knew that, because you're going to get another question that will ask you where the center of the circle is. So you have to know that it's the opposite sign of that and the opposite sign of that. Okay? And you have to know that number is not r, it's r squared. So you'll be able to handle problems about circles. They're a piece of cake if you know those things. They really are. That becomes an easy problem, not a hard problem, as long as you know your general formulas and your general processes. Completing the square is a very, very common process in algebra. You not only have to do it for all the conic sections, but you got to do it to put a quadratic into vertex format. You got to be able to complete the square. There's all kinds of cases where you have to complete the square. So that's something you definitely need to know how to do, is both complete the square and your general formula.
Okay.
Yeah, they're never going to give it to you in the nice format. not at least at question 24. If it was question 1, they might say, okay, you're looking at x minus 3 squared plus y plus 2 squared equals 4. What's the radius? Okay, maybe. That would be the easiest level. But this level here addresses all concerns. You have to know the general formula, and you have to know how to complete the square. Go ahead. What's your question, Ben?
So my question is, for the math portion of the SAT, like the big equations that you should memorize, would those like include like the equation of a circle, quadratic formula, and like performance and stuff, and some stuff like that?
You actually just named it. I don't know of anything besides those two.
Okay.
There are. Like I said, I don't know that we've come across the equation of an ellipse. An ellipse is a little bit more complicated. And I'm not sure it's worth us spending our time teaching you about ellipses. That's like a half-hour subject.
Okay.
But circles, for sure. You do definitely want to know the equation of a circle. Now, if you're talking, let's just make sure you understand the difference here. The thing they generally teach you is this: x squared plus y squared equals r squared. That is a circle, but it's a circle whose origin is at 0, 0. So if the origin is the center of the circle, that's all you need. But if the center is anywhere other than the origin, then it's x minus h squared plus y minus k squared. And notice it's always minus. You can't give me a single formula that isn't minus. When you're dealing in vertex format for quadratics, it's x minus h. When you're dealing all your conic sections, it's x minus h, it's y minus k. When you're looking at y-intercept, it's x minus p times x minus q. It's always minus, which means the actual value of the p, the q, the h, or the k is going to be the opposite of what you end up with. If you end up with x plus 2, then h is minus 2.
Okay.
Okay? All right. There may be others that I'm not remembering that you would have to memorize, but the two main ones are the quadratic formula and the general formula of a circle, not at the origin.
Okay.
Okay? All right. Let's talk about 25. Linear function means what? Straight line. That's what linear means. It means the graph, they could have said the graph of the straight line. So it has, let's draw it. If you don't know what to do, especially on a problem like this, let's draw it. Now, this should be pretty tough. We just saw a problem that was tough, so we're not talking about real easy problems here. But guess what? This isn't going to be that tough.
Okay.
So where should I start?
Let's see.
What does this mean?
Well, yeah. So you know has intercepts, so that a is x and 0 is y.
Okay. So that point is right there. In other words, it's definitely, that is the x-intercept. It's not the y-intercept. Because the y value is 0.
Mm-hmm.
And it has that as an intercept. That's got to be the y-intercept. Because it has an x value of 0. That's how you can tell which is which. Okay? Now, I know that that's that, but I don't really know that A is positive or B is positive. In other words, A actually could be on the other side of the y-axis, and I would have a different slope line, right?
Mm-hmm.
In other words, they didn't say A was a positive number. However, they do say A plus B equals 0. That means A equals minus B. Well, the way I've drawn it, A kind of equals B, right?
Mm-hmm.
So for A to equal minus B, that's where I should have drawn it. And I would have a line like that. And notice their answers. Everything's talking about the slope of this line. It's either positive, it's negative, it's 0, or it's undefined. Okay? Well, so far, I've gone through the problem, and I've gotten to this point right there, and I got two different lines. One has a positive slope, one has a negative slope. Now, A is not equal to B. That doesn't really affect things. A could have been 4, B could have been 3.9, and this picture still would have fit. So I don't know that that really matters. Which of the following is true about the slope of the graph? Well, it can't be that, and it can't be that. Wow. Let me think for a second. This is extra tough, because it doesn't appear that it can be any of the four answers. But this information here is the key. Because what it says is A is equal to minus B, and A is not equal to B. Which means A and B cannot be 0. Because if A and B were 0, that would be true, but that would be false. So A has to be a different number than B. So I could play around with making up some numbers. Let's make an A of 2, and that means B, is minus 2. Well, that means this can't be true. So these two statements are a little contradictory. We have A equals minus B, and yet A is not equal to B. Can you find any two A's and B's where that's true?
Mm-mm.
Give me an A and a B where both of those are true. There aren't any.
Yeah.
If A was 1 and B was 1, well, no, then A wouldn't be equal to minus B. So B would have to be minus 1. In other words, here's some. A could be 1 and B could be minus 1, right? That satisfies both of those. In other words, A, 1 is equal to a negative 1. So that would be true, and that would be true. So let's start drawing possible answers. In other words, that's definitely a possibility. And that should give us our answer. A is equal to 1, B is equal to minus 1. So A is there, B is there. That slope is positive. And that's all I need. In other words, what I have to do is to be able to draw a picture, which I've done. That point is 1, 0. And this point is 0, minus 1. And A is 1 and B is negative 1. Now, that is satisfied, right? 1 plus negative 1 is 0. That is satisfied because 1 is not equal to negative 1. And I have a positive slope for sure. So that has to be the answer, and there can't be multiple answers. There's only one of these 4 answers can be correct. So if I have found a number for A and B that satisfies everything in this paragraph and that results in a positive slope, then that has to be the answer. I don't need to even consider the other 3.
Okay.
Okay. And so the way to do this problem really was to pick numbers. Didn't realize it at first, but once I finally understood the problem, the solution is to pick numbers. And that isn't always true, because usually when you pick numbers, you have variables in the problem and you have variables in the answer. But if you think about it, a positive slope means that A over B is greater than 0. So you do kind of have variables in the answers. In other words, being a positive slope means I can substitute variables. So in a way, I do have variables in the problem, and I have variables in all 4 answers. It's just you don't see them. But if it's negative, then A over B is less than 0. If it's 0, then A divided by B is 0. And if it's undefined, A divided by B is infinity or undefined. So in a way, each of these 4 answers does have the 2 variables. And that's what you look for. When you see that in a problem, especially a difficult problem, think about picking some numbers. And that's all you have to do is pick numbers that satisfy the constraints that they give you. They really only gave us 4 constraints. We have to have the x-intercept, we have to have the y-intercept, we have to know a plus b equals 0, and we have to know a is not equal to b. As long as we satisfy those 4 things with the numbers we pick, then whatever slope we came up with, that has to be the answer. If I'd have come up with a negative slope, I would have been done. I would have answered B, and I would have gone on from there. Okay. All right. Let's look at 26. Now these are a little tricky because they're really kind of 3 questions in one. This looks like 1 question, but it's not. It's 3 questions. They are asking you, is that true? Is that true? Is that true? So those are the 3 questions. After you get answers to each of those 3 questions, then you can figure out which answer is correct. Okay. So it's really 3 questions in one, but this is actually a pretty easy one. This is one of the easiest ones we've seen on the test, especially with a high number on it. Tell me what f of minus 4 is.
So I'm kind of, okay, so.
Okay, when you have that kind of notation, what that is saying is, what is y when x is minus 4?
Okay, yeah, that's what I was wondering. Okay, gotcha.
Right there, y is equal to f of x.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, so the y-axis, I could really just call that the f of x axis. So what's f of minus 4?
Negative 1?
What's the y value on that right there?
1.
So it's positive 1. It's not negative 1. Negative 4. The x value is negative 4, but the y value is positive 1. What is f of 3/2? Remember, what's inside your parentheses is the x value. What it's equal to is the f of x value.
Yeah. Also 1?
Correct, because that's the x value that corresponds to 3/2. That's the y value that corresponds to 3/2. So that's also equal to 1. Now, how about f of 3?
Also 1?
So what is our answer?
D?
I think you said D. Yeah, that's how you do those kind of problems. You have to go through each of the 3 and decide whether it's true or not. In other words, I could have put a yes, true, true, true. And that's frequently what you have to answer is true or false. And then you pick the answer that matches the 3 you came up with. Okay? But you'll admit that once you know what they're talking about here, this is a super easy problem.
Yeah.
But it does require you to understand f of x notation and how to read a graph where x is your horizontal scale and f of x is your vertical scale. Same exact thing as x and y. They're telling you that when they tell you y equals f of x. It's just f of x is a little better kind of notation because you can do stuff like that. In other words, I can't say what is y of minus 4. That doesn't make any sense. But I can say what is f of minus 4. So f of x notation is far more valuable than y. And as you go higher in mathematics, you'll start running into f of x notation or g of x or h of x because it allows you to evaluate a function.
Okay.
27 is this super long one on the right, which can't even get on the whole page. Hold on. I'm going to minimize it just to be able to see the whole thing. Still can't. Well, let's do it in 2 steps.
Okay.
This is a science question, which means our first goal is to understand what we're looking at. Look at the title, look at the horizontal axis, look at the vertical axis, and tell me what the pattern is.
Okay. Makes sense.
And also read the paragraph. In other words, as long as we're looking at this page, not only look at the graph, but the paragraph gives you a lot of information also about it. In other words, the information is not just in the title and the horizontal and vertical axis. It's in that paragraph also. So let's underline some stuff here. What are the key things? And I've become a firm believer in this. 2 samples of water of equal mass are heated to 60. That's this point right there. 1 sample is poured into an insulated container. The other is poured into a non-insulated container. Well, these are the insulated containers. These are the non-insulated containers. The samples are then left for 70 minutes to cool in a room having a temperature of 25 degrees. That's the temperature of the room, not the temperature of the water. This is the temperature of the water. The graph above shows the temperature of each sample at 10-minute intervals. Well, clearly you can see that the insulated ones don't cool off as fast, right?
Mm-hmm.
In other words, after 10 minutes, the insulated one was still above 50, and the non-insulated one was barely above 40. In other words, the non-insulated ones cool off much quicker than the insulated ones. Okay. Which of the following statement correctly compares the average rates at which the temperature of the two samples change? Well, let's look at all those questions. We might be able to just get away with looking at each question. In every 10-minute interval, the magnitude of the rate of change of the insulated is greater than that of the non-insulated. Is that true or false? Which one was changing more rapidly, the insulated or the non-insulated?
The non-insulated one was changing more rapidly.
So that's not correct. Right?
Yeah.
In other words, they're saying the magnitude of the insulated one is greater than the non-insulated one. Well, it's the exact opposite.
Yeah. Okay, yeah.
That's not true. In every 10-minute interval, the magnitude of the rate of change of the non-insulated is greater than that of the insulated.
That one's right.
That sounds right. And because it's such a long problem, I'm not sure I even spend time on the other two. Because B is correct for sure. If I go back and look at that picture, they said the magnitude of the rate of change. Well, what's the magnitude of the rate of change? It's the difference between that level and that level. That is a bigger number than the difference between that level and that level.
Right.
And that's the magnitude of the rate of change. So I'm done with the problem after B. Excuse me. Yeah, let's see if we got time to. And notice how much time it's going to take to even analyze C and D. They're 5-sentence paragraphs in themselves, 6-sentence, 7.
Yeah.
So it's going to take me another minute to figure out what C and D are talking about. I've already found an answer that's correct. I'm not wasting my time on C and D, especially not on a hard problem. If B isn't the answer, then this is probably a hard problem I wouldn't expect to get right anyway. Let's just, again, I need to minimize it so I can get all the, let's do 28 and be done with it. Okay, ABCD is a square. Center of the square is E. They give you the coordinates of C and E. Which of the following is an equation of the line that passes through B and D? Well, let's just talk about, we're not going to have time to do this whole problem today, but let's talk about some concepts and we'll come back to it. First of all, let's draw that line. Don't be afraid to draw up your, hold on. Let me see if I do it this way, if I can get that line to go through E. Well, first of all, I got to get it to draw. So, wow, hold on a second. The computer is acting weird here. All right. So, which of the following is the equation of that line? Well, immediately, what do we know about that line and line AC? What's true about them?
Perpendicular.
Okay, that tells you a lot about slope. When two lines are perpendicular, what's the slope of one relative to the slope of the other? If I told you that the slope of AC was 1/2, tell me what the slope of BD is.
Isn't it the same?
Got to do two things. Well, look at it. It's not positive, first of all,
Yeah.
and it's not flat. It's steep. So you got to do two things. You got to switch the sign, and you got to reciprocate it. So the slope of B is -2.
Yeah.
So what that means is the whole thing of this problem is figuring out the slope of AC. That's going to go a long way. Okay. Well, so all I got to do is look at the answers, and I know the slope of AC is going to be 1/3. It's not 3, right?
Right.
And therefore, the slope of BD is going to be -3. So one of those has to be our answer. If we're towards the end of the test, or if we're in the difficult part of the test, we've got a very difficult problem and we've narrowed it down to only two choices. If we have to guess, it's how can we guess between those two? What's the y-intercept on A?
-1.
Is that the y-intercept on my drawing? No, the y-intercept is way up here, the way I've drawn it. It's positive.
Yeah.
What's the y-intercept on B?
+1.
That's got to be the answer.
Yeah.
It's of our two choices, it's the only one that has a positive y-intercept. Both of them have slopes of -3. Both answers. The only difference is the y-intercept, and the y-intercept on B is a positive number because this translates to -3x plus 1, and that's the red line that I drew. I don't need to do any complicated math to make that doesn't look like 1, it looks like 3, but the one thing I'm absolutely sure of is that the y-intercept is positive, it's not negative. The other thing I'm absolutely certain of is the slope of that line is negative and it's steep. So it's a number greater than 1, like -3. When I say greater than 1, I mean the absolute value of it is greater than 1. Just like the slope of that is less than 1. So the slope of that line has to be positive 1/3, which makes the slope of that line -3. So that's the key thing to remember about this problem, is the difference between slopes of perpendicular lines. All right?
All right, sounds good.
And I will talk to you next Saturday.
All right, great. Thank you.
All right.